This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet, joined again this week by Shane Morris. Shane, great to have you back here to have this conversation.
It's great to be back, John. I'm always happy to pinch hit for Warren, even though he's the real rock star. So we'll make this. Was that a mixed metaphor?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, that's true, but you were homeschooled. I don't expect you to know all these kind of either rock music or sports metaphors. There's a limit there. I mean, you are from Florida, the home of Tim Tebow, and he seemed to have gotten it all right.
Well, he's been in at least two sports, so he's doing okay.
Yeah, he is. And when he releases his next debut rock album, then the metaphor will be complete. Hey, I want to start with an interesting and maybe a little bit of a shocking study that was reported on this past week from Britain. Now, let me preface this by saying I have long thought that if you really want to know what's happening in the world, you read the Grumpy Brits. And what I mean by the Grumpy Brits are people like Theodore Dalrymple and these writers in Britain that basically are looking at their culture going, the greatness of our civilization has long passed. And I often think that, we often talk about how Europe is a couple decades ahead, at least in terms of secularization and where that's leading. So maybe this fits into that category as well. But this was a survey that's been done a couple times, and it was just basically a survey just measuring all kinds of things across the UK. But the one that I want to bring out is, and this is reported in The Sun, it was reported in a couple different places in the UK this past week, but a staggering, and this is the kind of the subheadline of the Sun article, 9 in 10 young Brits believe their life lacks purpose. 90%, 89% to be specific, of 16 to 29-year-olds claim that their life lacks purpose or meaning. Now, the other part of this is that it's an average of 80% across all the age demographics, and even 55% once you're over 60. So across all age demographics, you're talking about a real problem of not knowing what life is all about. There's a high level of claimed anxiety, directionlessness, failure to live their best life. Now we're kind of getting to the question of meaning and purpose. And these are pretty high numbers. I don't know what they would be in the United States. We've seen little studies, but we talked last time, Shane, about the recent shootings in El Paso and Dayton, and how the failure to give young men meaning and purpose is at least a factor that needs to be considered here. And this seems to kind of back that up.
Yeah, it almost seems like when you have a culture that has accepted the idea that any meaning goes, people lose the ability to find meaning. They don't know what to do. What's the purpose? And the transformation here is just so stark. My wife and I are watching a documentary series from 2009 called World War II in Color. And the section on the Battle of Britain is just striking. You look at people who came through overwhelming odds, who resisted the Nazis with a small air force, and then when all their cities were bombed to oblivion, and they stood strong, and Churchill rallied the nation. Just barely a lifetime later, to contemplate the idea that 80% of Brits think their life lacks purpose. I mean, it's stunning what has happened, and the fact that the real increase has happened not since World War II, but actually in the past 10 years. That's been the most significant increase. I mean, that's a really stunning transformation, John. It almost is hard for me to believe the numbers.
Yeah, it is. You kind of wonder, who are they, did they catch everyone coming out of a Marilyn Manson concert or something? And that was their study group. Because these numbers are shocking. But I just read through Os Guinness's new book. In fact, it's a book that we'll be talking about here in the coming weeks. But it's a book on this concept of meaning. And Francis Schaeffer often talked about kind of this line of despair where ideas are, kicked around among the elites, and then they find themselves embedded in universities, and then they go from kind of high culture to pop culture, and then it kind of affects the rest of us. That's something that we can really trace when it comes to this question of meaning and purpose. I mean, you go to the existentialist philosophers. Well, you start with Friedrich Nietzsche, who, famously said God is dead. There's nothing but power. So power becomes kind of what you live for. And that's something that's just not available to most of the population. So that brings you a meaninglessness. And then, amongst the elites, if you talk about Jean-Paul Sartre or others who wrestle with this question of meaning, and then you go to the pop culture of the 70s and 80s. And I remember a kind of famous article in Time magazine wrestling with kind of the new rebel of the 90s, and comparing kind of the rebel of James Dean, and even Bart Simpson was often bullied in The Simpsons, but he often kind of won the day because he was clever and smart. And so I'm better than you, I'm bigger than you, that kind of rebel and bully. But you get to the 90s and Beavis and Butthead, and you get to this kind of life has no meaning, and in the music of Eminem, which is not only you're worthless, but I'm worthless, we're all worthless. And not to mention, obviously, kind of harder rock genres that communicated that to a generation. And you have this direct line. Seinfeld was famously the show about nothing. The philosopher Thomas Hibbs wrote a terrific book back in the 90s called Shows About Nothing, how pop culture was communicating nihilism. Is this the kind of the inevitable result of the ideas that we've been kicking around in high culture and pop culture, that you actually get to a point where it affects real lives? Is this kind of ideas have consequences being played out in real life?
Yeah, I wonder that. And I also wonder how it maps onto the United States. If you look at the social justice movements here, various, racial, sexual, gender, all of them are kind of rooted in some sort of idea that life still has meaning. So I don't know if we're nihilists, and I don't know whether the same sort of holds true in the UK. Or maybe there's a case where the social justice set are kind of looking for new meaning in a new set of moral principles and thundering moral pronouncements that aren't grounded in religion or any sort of ultimate metaphysical framework. What do you think about that? I'm not really sure how to reconcile those two things, because on the one hand, we do seem very passionate about certain issues, that if you turn on the news, there are people marching in rallies for causes that make moral claims. But on the other hand, there's this widespread movement of saying life has no meaning, that there's just no purpose to it all.
I think that's a great question. So here's my take on this. First, I think there is a marked difference between Gen Xers, for example, and Millennials, and especially Xers. I mean, I look at Gen Xers, I think, man, we really ruined the world. I mean, we were worthless. There was nothing you could get us off the couch, for. We were addicted. We were living for stuff and pleasure. This was the 90s. That we kind of came into our own and so on. And I think that 9/11 was a real sobering thing for most of the world, but especially the United States. And that's a marked difference. So you do see younger generations care in a way that Gen Xers don't. But the question of whether you care and still find life meaninglessness, I'm not sure that those are two completely opposite propositions. I mean, I think at some level it should be inconsistent, right? To say, well, life has no meaning, and so what am I going to do? But, this is the philosophical, wranglings of Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, the only reason he didn't kill himself was that would be using his freedom to take away his freedom, and freedom was all he had left. And you think, boy, if that's what gets you up in the morning, I don't know how many more times you're going to get up in the morning. So I think there's oftentimes an inconsistency of living, believing that life has no meaning, but trying to force it in on your own life. But the second thing that I want to say is that, and I owe this thought really to Anthony Esselin's book called Nostalgia, and it's a strong critique of the progressive movement, which is progressivism really has become. I mean, it's almost an oxymoron of the word itself. That progressivism is much less progressive in the sense that it's much less has a clear place that it's trying to advance to. And it's much more a critique that everything else in the past is bad. It's kind of a revised version of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. When he was writing about that, he was talking about kind of the modern movement, that everything newer is necessarily better. As Esselin puts it, and I think in a really profound way, that most progressives now just know that the world's terrible and that everything is holding them back and it's always somebody else's fault, but there's never really a clear vision of where to get to. And you look at all the social justice movements that we see, and I'm not saying universally, I'm not saying that people shouldn't work towards justice and to make the world a better place. That's kind of one of the best things that Christianity ever brought to the world. At the same time, that today's these protests, the social justice warriors, oftentimes I get the impression that SLN is right, that it's a critique of what's gone before, but it's not really a clear vision of some future place that we can actually get to. Does that make sense?
It does, and that's why I kind of open with the question of whether when anything goes, when any meaning is sufficient, whether people kind of see through that and know that there really is no meaning. It's kind of like what Buddy in The Incredibles said, when everyone's special, no one will be. Well, when everyone's right, no one will be. And if you don't have a cohesive vision of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a society, well, it's chaos, and there's a marked difference between a culture that comes together, as one to resist a common enemy, as you saw in World War II, and even before that, with the great religious documents and movements that came out of British nation and culture. So much of what we look back on as our English-speaking religious heritage came from that. When most people get married, they still use some form of of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer and the wording in that. So yeah, I think maybe there is a way to reconcile the two, the passion for social justice and the moral claims on the one hand, but the nihilism that underlies all of that and the lack of a sense of deeper meaning. Well, it's that everyone has meaning and it's become subjective. And people may be passionate about their subjective meanings, but at the end of the day, we all know that we're all just kind of trying to fill a void that's left behind by the departure of God, so to speak.
Well, I don't know what other program you can possibly listen to where you're going to hear referenced in one segment Jean-Paul Sartre, Winston Churchill, Thomas Hibbs, Eminem, and Buddy from The Incredibles. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here with Shane Morris. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
That was great.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Shane Morris. Come to Breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says Resources Mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to various articles and resources on the topics that we're talking about on today's program. And don't miss a single episode of our Breakpoint commentaries or Breakpoint This Week, and you can do that by going to wherever you get your podcast and signing up, subscribing to the Breakpoint podcast. Shane, we spent the first segment talking about this just amazing study out of Britain that nearly 90% of young Brits think that their life is meaningless. And we could spend the whole program talking about that because there's not a more important question than meaning. That's why I'm really excited, by the way. I mentioned this in the last segment with Os Guinness's new book, where he's wrestling with that. I think it's called Carpe Diem Redeemed. Not out yet, but it'll be something we talk more about next month in September. But almost on the polar opposite of that is a story that has been coming out, emerging out of Hong Kong for weeks now. We've talked on Breakpoint over the last several weeks about the protest of Hong Kong residents against mainland China based on an extradition law that has since kind of been tabled. There's some, the Chinese say it's tabled, stop protesting, and the Hong Kong folks say not really, not quite yet. But they came out again in force this week, the protesters in Hong Kong. Really interesting things that we're seeing over there. First of all, they shut down the airport, which is, that is a significant inconvenience to shut down the Hong Kong airport in particular with all the traffic throughout Asia. It obviously interrupts the commerce, the significance that Hong Kong plays kind of in that whole region of the world and really globally around trade and business is huge. But we're up to I think 10 weeks now with these pro-democracy protests. And one of the things we've talked about, and there was some violence this past week, I think that the protesters actually then quickly apologized for But there's been a distinct Christian leadership to these protests, which is interesting as well. But this goes on, and I think it's a major distraction for the Chinese government, right at a time when tariffs are kicking in, and that kind of trade war with the United States continues. This is really interesting to watch.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that we can put a unique spin on this program, I think, because there's the political analysis. The obvious facts of the case are that since 1997, Hong Kong has been handed over to China, and this is despite the fact that its law, the civil rights that its citizens have, and its economic system were all shaped by the fact that it was a former British colony. And all of that's true. There is a political component here. But on a deeper level, as you said back in June on Breakpoint, there's also a worldview clash going on here between communism and a Western worldview that is shot through with Christian overtones, to be quite frank. China, for all its reforms, is still communist, and it sees Hong Kong as this kind of opportunity to exploit, but also a dangerous beacon to the Chinese people who've lived under communism for so long. It's a reminder, in a way, that there's another way of doing things, that what freedom looks like. The very fact that those in Hong Kong know what's going on in the world around them, and even next door in mainland China, better than those in mainland China do themselves, because they've got unfiltered internet in Hong Kong. That just speaks volumes. I mean, the political and economic freedom, especially religious freedom, demonstrated in Hong Kong can be a thing, and China's afraid of that, I think.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. And they've historically demonstrated how afraid that they are, and at the same time thinking that this experiment of basically one nation, two peoples, or however they called it. I forget what the phrase was exactly.
Yeah, one nation, two systems.
Yeah, one nation, two systems. That's actually a possibility. I mean, that is something that it's not just two systems. It's two systems not only diametrically opposed to each other in so many ways, but two systems that are grounded in completely different visions of life in the world. And and this is what you just mentioned, all of the reforms that China has. Well, yeah, but we've also seen in the last year and a half the crackdown on personal freedom. China wants economic prosperity that has only really come from offering a level of human freedom without offering that human freedom. And cracking down especially on religion. There was an interesting podcast this past week on The Daily, which is a New York Times podcast, about whether China is actually, there's been some reports that China's freeing prisoners that are Muslim Uyghurs. It's something we've talked about a lot on Breakpoint. And basically the podcast was all about, it was just heartbreaking that, again, it's a show. Freeing Uyghurs, letting them report to their families that they're safe, and then putting them right back in prison. And so China wants really the benefits that only come from a particular vision of life in the world without adopting that vision of life in the world. And that's the conflict. I think it's irreconcilable. I don't know how – I mean, it's amazing that this experiment with Hong Kong has lasted, 20 years, but it was supposed to last at least 50 years. That was the agreement. And we're not even halfway there, and it's falling apart.
Yeah, what you mentioned about Islam is very fascinating and important to note, because communism historically looks very unkindly on religion, especially Christianity, but not only Christianity. And there's a very good reason for that. Communism seeks to control people's minds and hearts and allegiances. Going all the way back to Mao's revolution and even to the Soviets, it's really clear that communism seeks to set itself up as an alternative god. It's an idol. An allegiance to someone higher than the communist state is it's poisonous to them. It's incompatible with the ideology. And so, like you said, there's an experiment that was supposed to last for 50 years in Hong Kong from the point of the handover in 1997. And it seems to be falling apart before our eyes. And it's something of a David-Goliath scenario, right? I mean, David in this case is also the golden goose, because Hong Kong is, this economic powerhouse that China does not want to lose, but they don't want the freedoms and the liberties, and yes, the religious allegiances that made that sort of thing possible. I'll tell you what really fascinated me, John, was seeing the way there's this kind of mutual resonance that's developed between the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong and Christians, not just in America, but all around the world. And I think it was on my my Facebook news feed, protesters they're waving American flags in Hong Kong, and they're singing our national anthem. I even saw this meme. It was a modified Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me rattlesnake, with a Chinese dragon in the place of the rattlesnake, and it said, "Don't tread on me," in both English and Chinese. And then
Wow.
there was another one that had a picture of the protesters waving American flags, and the caption was, "Be the America Hong Kong thinks you are." And that's just fascinating. I mean, they're not only Christian undertones, but undertones of political liberty that are looking to America in particular for inspiration, despite the fact that historically Hong Kong is linked with the UK.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating. And it's also a warning, because in the American context right now, we've got politicians pitching out ideas all the time, promising that they'll work this time. You listen to whether we're talking about Bernie Sanders or we're talking about the Squad, and this push towards, socialism. And socialism, like communism, kind of communism's twin sister, socialism also is grounded in a vision of the human person. And it will only work if that vision of the human person is actually true. And that's where I think the Chinese government keeps running into a wall, because you can think particular things about the universe, and you can think particular things about the human person. This goes back to our first conversation about meaning. You can think the world has no meaning, but you live in a world that's infused with meaning, which is why we find ourselves, marveling at sunsets and crying when a baby is born and grieving over deep loss. And communism is based on a particular vision of the world. So is socialism. And you can't have the benefits of those things if they're, while rejecting that which is true and that which is good. It just doesn't work that way. And that's why we say ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. You're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We're talking about the issues that are making the headlines from a Christian worldview. Something that we're going to talk about early next week on Breakpoint, Shane, is a headline from a publication called the National Catholic Register. And let me contextualize this one as well. I've been fascinated with the area of bioethics since grad school, so really for about 25 years, and in particular the unintended consequences of human scientific arrogance, and even just kind of how fast our technological and medical capability has grown in comparison with our ethics. And at the time, I remember talking about the hundreds of thousands of embryos that are the excess, quote-unquote, products of in vitro fertilization that are now in freezers. And I've had this conversation with a whole lot of different folks involved in various medical facilities and the sort of ethical guidelines they've tried to bring on IVF as when they understood this as a problem. But the headline of the National Catholic Register article this week said at fertility clinics, abandoned human embryos could number in the millions. In the millions. Abandoned human embryos in the U.S. could number in the millions. Just in the United States. That is a stunning, stunning number.
Yeah, the Register actually picked this up from NBC in a new report. At one clinic in Fort Myers, it actually said, which is not far from me, it actually said that over a third of the embryos frozen there in their supercooled nitrogen freezers are considered abandoned. The parents have stopped paying the storage fees. And the question we got to ask ourselves is, why does this happen? And why are the numbers growing so quickly? And what should we do about it? I mean, given the fact that we believe all life begins at conception, as we proclaim regularly when we argue against things like abortion, this should be an area of concern for us. The problem I see is that for too many Protestant and evangelical churches, this has been a taboo. It's something that they don't talk about from the pulpit, in premarital counseling. basically anywhere. It's a subject that you don't touch. And you mentioned that it was the National Catholic Register that picked it up. Well, of course it was, because the Catholic Church for a long time has had a very robust and well-articulated bioethic when it comes to the beginning of life, obviously articulated most clearly in Humanae Vitae. And evangelicals don't have a similar document. We haven't articulated those things in a similar way. Yeah, this sort of thing has been standard practice in the IVF trade for a long time. The production of multiple embryos, which is why this happens in the first place, that a woman has multiple eggs harvested, up to 40, 50, 60 per cycle, and then all of those are fertilized, and then only she'll end up carrying maybe 3 or 4 to term. The rest get left behind. And that's just been standard operating procedure for a very long time. Now, there is another procedure that has sort of come up on the radar recently, John, and you can tell us a little bit more about that. It's being practiced at certain clinics right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And again, medical facilities have tried to bring guidelines around this. I've worked with some folks, for example, who on the board of large healthcare systems in the South, and they said, look, we recognize that this was a problem. So the ethical guidelines they put in place was not to basically ban in vitro fertilization at those places, but to say, look, you can only fertilize one egg at a time, or you can and implant that egg and try it, and that's how we're going to do these rounds. Or second, you have to make a commitment that you are going to implant every embryo that is created. And that's a very different way of doing it. I mean, the thought has been the failure rate of in vitro fertilization is still very, very high. And so the thought has been if you have more embryos, then you have a higher chance of success. Now, I had a conversation months ago with David Stevens, the head of the Christian Medical and Dental Association. I'm with you where I lean more towards thinking the Catholic bioethic on this is the right one, that in vitro fertilization as a practice is ethically problematic. Not everyone agrees with me on that, and I understand where they're coming from. David, for example, argued that IVF can be done ethically, and it would be done ethically in one of those two ways. And there's interesting research that seems to suggest that implanting one embryo has just as high a success rate as implanting multiple ones and hoping, quote unquote, one of them lasts, or more than one of them lasts. So that's an interesting, again, it's not conclusive, but there's research that suggests that, and so there's hospitals that have tried to put around ethical guidelines that way. But look, the problem is that when it comes to reproductive technologies, we have two problems. Number one, again, our ethics has lagged way behind of our technology. So what we can do equals what we should do, and especially in the wake of the sexual revolution, the ethical considerations around in vitro fertilization was, will it help people get what they want? And if the answer is yes, then the practice is yes. And I'm not saying Christians who have ventured into this world haven't spent more time wrestling with it and thinking through the ethics of it, and maybe came to the conclusion that David did. And I appreciate that if they did. But I'm talking about the practice in general, which is why you have millions now of discarded embryos. This you said this should be something that Christians should care about. Good heavens, this is a human rights crisis. We're talking about millions of abandoned children. To borrow the phrase from my friend Scott Klusendorf, if you trot out the toddler, in other words, if there were millions of abandoned 2-year-olds, we would consider it a great human rights crisis. But are we considering this one? And that brings up the second real problem, which is the church has not led in specifically adding this to premarital counseling. And I think this is a real tragedy and a failure of the church, the Protestant church at least, where we basically, when a couple wants to get married, say, well, hey, what do you think about kids? Are you guys on the same page? There's not an inherent, theological grounding for them of the connection between sex and marriage and babies. There's not a wrestling with the creation mandate of be fruitful and multiply. And so if there's not those things, we're nowhere close to wrestling with reproductive technologies. But that's where bioethics is. We've had a couple decades now of wrestling with the ethics of taking life, but we're smack in the middle of an ethical dilemma when it comes to making and remaking life, not just taking life, to paraphrase Nigel Cameron. And we're way behind on this. We'll come to breakpoint.org click on the link there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to some of the articles and resources on the topics that we talked about on today's program. Again, that's breakpoint.org, breakpoint.org. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us. You've been listening to Breakpoint This Week.